Differences between petty cash and cash float. Petty cash versus cash float. Petty cash is a small and fixed amount of cash kept on hand for specific, minor expenses such as office supplies, postage, or employee reimbursements. Whereas, cash float is the total amount of money set aside for daily, miscellaneous expenses, covering a broader range of needs. The purpose of petty cash is to intend for specific, predefined purposes with strict guidelines on usage. Whereas, the purpose of cash float is to available for any small, unplanned expenses that arise during daily operations, offering more flexibility in spending. The scope of petty cash is limited to specific, predetermined expenses, preventing the misuse of funds for purposes other than those designated. Whereas, the scope of cash float is more broad in scope, covering various daily expenses without strict limitations, allowing for a wider range of usability. The control of petty cash is typically under strict control and supervision, with designated custodians responsible for managing and disbursing funds. Whereas, the control of cash float is relatively more flexible, but still monitored to prevent misuse. Oversight may be distributed across multiple individuals or departments. The funding of petty cash is a fixed amount that is replenished periodically based on actual usage and submission of receipts. Whereas, the funding of cash float is a fluctuating amount adjusted as needed, with periodic reviews to determine the appropriate level of funds required. The documentation of petty cash requires detailed records and receipts for every transaction, fostering accountability and transparency. Whereas, the documentation of cash float is still necessary but may be less rigid, allowing for a more streamlined process for smaller, routine transactions. The accountability of petty cash is usually assigned to a specific individual or department, promoting individual responsibility and tracking of expenses. Whereas, the accountability of cash float is shared among multiple individuals or departments, fostering a collaborative approach to managing daily expenditures. The replenishment process of petty cash requires a formal request for replenishment, often accompanied by a review of receipts and documentation. Whereas, cash float can be replenished more informally as needed, with periodic assessments to adjust the fund amount based on changing requirements. Petty cash is less flexible due to specific allocation of funds, ensuring that the money is used only for its intended purposes. Whereas, cash float is more flexible, as it can be used for various purposes, providing adaptability to meet the diverse needs of daily operations. The monitoring of petty cash is regularly audited to ensure compliance with established guidelines and to identify any discrepancies in fund usage. Whereas, the cash float is monitored but with a slightly more lenient approach, focusing on maintaining control while allowing for the necessary adaptability in spending. Kindly subscribe my YouTube channel Thesis Helper. Thanks for watching.